Yes.
I just wanted to clarify something. For a generator with a day tank, isn't that size containing? But you just said it was durable.
So for a generator with a day tank, isn't that sized containment? So what Pete was saying is that you could have an example where the generator itself might be considered the oil field operational equipment, but then if you have a bulk storage tank that's connected to it, then that would be subject to the sized containment.
I guess I would also try and clarify that it would have to be a case scenario for the day tank and how it's designed, its capacity, how it's fed, what its valving and controls are, where it sits in the line, its capacity. Those would be determinations that would be looked at to say, well, okay, it's a day tank, but the way it's configured is part of the transfer piping system, and it's not really more than that, then general containment would apply. But if that day tank was significantly sized and it was, had controls on either side, it may there also be a bulk storage container in its own right.
Well, I just know like in other classes, they teach us if the generator has a day tank is your bulk storage, and you have to have size containment.
Mm-hmm. That's what I remember too.
Okay, so if it's below 55 gallons, then I would say probably not going to be bulk storage. Again, depends on the plumbing and the way the system's operated, and I think you'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
What's that?
Well, then the double wall construction, she's asking about a double wall container. That's going to be inherently double wall, so there is size secondary containment associated with that. Sorry, prosecutor.
No.
I'm sorry if I missed this, but my recollection was that APSA has a minimum facility threshold of something like 1320 gallons or something, and I may have missed that part of this presentation, and now I'm hearing 55 gallons, which I'm presuming is the actual vessel versus the facility jurisdiction line. Could you clarify that for me?
55 gallons is the de minimis container size subject to the SPCC rule. So if you have a 30-gallon day tank or containers or pails, 1-quart units at the Craig Auto Center, EPA in 2002 amended the rule to identify 55 gallons de minimis container size for SPC subjectivity. Anything below that is exempt, and therefore we don't regulate them. You would calculate by adding together everything 55 gallons or greater to determine your threshold. If you exceed 1320, then that would conceivably trigger you into the SPCC regulation and or APSA if you are petroleum.
Okay, good. What I'll do is I'll clarify the point because I have on my notes something different than what Pete just said. So what I'll do is I'll clarify that point in my presentation and I'll upload it again, and you guys can check it out next week or something like that. All right, so moving on. I said we were going to talk about this type of operation right here. So a mobile refueler is what we're talking about in this photo. And there was a section that we referenced earlier and where we're talking about some exceptions from sized containment for bulk storage, and that exception would be for mobile refuelers. So what type of containment would this kind of a container or truck or tank car need to have? And let me start the thing here. Okay, there you go. All right, good job. Right, so general containment would be required for mobile refuelers. Very good. Except for when they're parked? You know, you can probably have exceptions to everything we say, but I guess there could be an argument that it's not being used as a mobile refueler and it's being used as a bulk storage tank. So then you're right. In that case, if it was something that is not being moved around and used like a mobile refueler, then it would be subject to the bulk tank.
We moved around the use of mobile refueler, but where you park it when it's not being used to refuel at that location where it's stored.
The SPCC rule was amended to provide relief to mobile refuelers at the behest of the airline industry, and because the majority of mobile refuelers are used at airports, and they made arguments to EPA and basically showed very solid evidence that there are very few, if any, complete collapse or failures of entire mobile refueler trucks. So EPA said, okay, we're going to provide relief to the airport industry, and then we said, oh wait, if we're going to provide relief to the airports on mobile refuelers, we're going to have to do that across the board. And so mobile refuelers, if it meets the intent and definition of a mobile refueler, i.e. it contains fuel that is used to move out into a facility and distribute the stored fuel into other pieces of equipment, aircraft or other vehicles or farm equipment, whatever it might be, those have been given relief, and the general containment requirements under 112.7c are applicable. And that would also mean when they are taken back to their sleeping area and staged overnight. And I have a spill kit over here, my mobile refueler's there, and my storm drain's there. I park them there. It's got some fuel in it. The general containment requirements are applicable. If there's a spill, I would deploy my spill kit or storm drain cover, and I still rely on that even though I leave my facility from 5 o'clock Friday till 8 o'clock Monday morning. You are stepping out on thin ice if you're going to do it that way. The potential for discharge, getting away from your facility and perhaps into a navigable water, increases significantly if the spill occurs and no one's there to deploy the spill kit that you're relying on as your active measure. But the point is that the mobile refuelers, if they are in fact that, they do enjoy the relief out of size containment into general containment. And as inspectors, I think for those of you out there, or facility folks needing to realize, if you see something like a tanker that doesn't have its truck component attached to it, that's probably going to be where the line is crossed and they're moving into bulk storage, and therefore would need size containment or would be cited under APSA or SPCC for inadequate containment.
Question? Yes?
So essentially, my recollection of the Federal Register, it was a time frame for mobile refuelers. Because I work in an airport facility. If the vehicle is being used within 24 hours, no size containment was required. But if the vehicle was parked for more than 24 hours away from the operation, then it had to be parked in a size containment. I think I missed the memo on this somewhere.
I may have missed that memo too. EPA and or APSA inspectors, CUPA inspectors, are not going to make the determination as to when it goes from, from general containment into bulk storage in terms of a time frame. That's going to be the responsibility of the owner-operator and the certifying professional engineer.
I just want to make sure I understood that that's the operation that we run by.
Certainly, as inspectors, you want to question something that looks a little questionable, right? That doesn't seem to be moving, and it looks like it's been there for weeks or months or years, and they're telling you it's a mobile refueler. Well, that's where you would push back and, sort of make a little noise about that.
Okay. Also find that missing memo.
Yeah, would you?
Okay, cool. Thank you. All right, just seeing if you're awake. We're going to do another question here. We talked about loading racks. What type of containment?
Loading rack, right?
A loading rack. What type of a containment must a loading rack have? Good. Specific containment. Sized for the largest trucks that's going to offload at that facility. All right. Question? Are we good? All right, so we're going to move on to talk about specific containment. Also, some people call it sized containment. And like Pete has answered a few questions already and referred to this as its application to bulk storage, permanent or fixed portable, and loading and unloading racks. And it is sized to contain the capacity of that largest single oil compartment, container or tank. And it is also required in that section that you have sufficient freeboard to contain precipitation, except for loading racks. It actually says that in the requirement. And then in accordance with good engineering practice. So what if it's inside the building? Do they have to have freeboard? What if it's inside the building? I heard a no. That's the right answer. So there's no, unless it's an open roof building, they wouldn't have to worry about freeboard. All right. And then one of the points that we've got to remember as inspectors is, again, this idea of performance-based. And there's a lot of flexibility built into the SPCC rule. And so we're sort of relying on the expertise of the facility, and if they have a PE that's certifying their plan, a professional engineer that's certifying their plan, then they're the ones who need to make those calculations and decide what that specific containment should be for that piece of equipment. Now, what about a big wall of 55-gallon drums? Let's say it's outside, maybe it's got a rain cover, and it's like 155-gallon drums that are all stored together in the same area. What size containment would they need to have? 55 gallons, that's right. And especially if there's a rain cover. If there's no rain cover, then they would need to, maybe have 65 gallons of containment. Yes, sir?
What's the inspector's practice if the secondary containment is clearly deficient, even from a layperson's perspective, but nonetheless the engineer certifies it as adequate?
Good question. Okay, so the question was, what is the inspector... If the inspector sees that the containment is clearly deficient, but the PE says it's good, what should the APSA inspector do? And I'm so glad Pete's here to answer this question.
Well, I think the nature of being an inspector is to question those aspects of the facility that look funky or lead to some concern of inadequacy or outright violation. A good example with 55-gallon drums would be the distinction between spill pallets and containment pallets, right? And we've all seen drums, 4 drums sitting on a little pallet that's got some sort of capacity for collecting any spillage, or maybe sized even larger for containment. So if the operator says, oh no, they're on spill pallets. Well, what's the capacity of the spill pallet? They're generally going to be less than 55 gallons, so therefore inadequate to account for that 55 gallons. And then whether or not, if they're outside exposed to rainfall, those can quickly be overwhelmed by stormwater. And so that's an issue. And important for the inspector to question something that doesn't look right. Generally, if a professional engineer is certifying a plan and the details are in the plan, I typically rely on the professional engineer, and that's why the professional engineer requirement is in there for those facilities that are 10,000 and above. I don't necessarily want to question a PE's determination and judgment and application of industry standard and good engineering judgment. It does happen. And if it's visually odd, then you can request more details or ask them to provide some more specific facts and numbers and calculations and data as to why the claim, well, why it's certified as adequate. Does that answer your question?
And it is going to be. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, there could be, and Pete's going to do another class on impracticability determinations. So there are some times when, for whatever reason, and a drum's not a good example, but for whatever reason, a facility is stating that they cannot have containment. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So that would be written into the plan, and they would have alternative measures for containment. Yes.
Along that point, that they took out the language that said to be impervious to oil for 72 hours. That was also in that guidance document at one point. And then you also have to, the PE is liable, and the inspector from the third party, either API or Steel Tank Institute, is also supposed to be looking at that. And that, to me, is, why we really should have monolithic core, in my opinion, to prevent any sort of leakage because of that rule.
So I think what he's getting at is there are requirements for sufficiently impervious containment, and the SPCC rule was modified to remove any language or intent of retaining spilled oil in a containment for 72 hours. That is a little bit too prescriptive for EPA. We rely on the professional engineer for the facility to make the determination as to what is going to be sufficiently impervious. And there's, again, flexibility. If you have a thick crude oil, some sort of compacted earth, basin and dike would be, in my opinion, probably pretty adequate to clean the oil up. So the rule now says sufficiently impervious to contain spilled oil until cleanup can occur. So rather than say 72-hour retention time, we now say till cleanup can occur. Well, how often are operators going to be on site or making rounds, say if it's a production facility that's not manned all the time? Can it retain oil overnight? Those are considerations that the owner-operator and the certifying professional engineer generally need to address for the type of oil that they are storing, and then determining whether or not their containment basin is adequate. We've got some significant challenges in the Hawaiian Islands right now, and we're working with a lot of facilities that were formally saying, if we had a spill into our containment, we'd be able to clean it up because we have operators that are around or can be on site with response contractors. Well, it's a lava porous based, setup over there, and some sort of like asphalt or concrete or, in fact, poly liners are probably going to be a lot better off than just a dirt basin and hopefully an operator control. We had a facility overfill a tank by 14,000 gallons. It hit the ground and percolated in. Within an hour, they lost 13,500 gallons. 900 gallons. So they lost 99% of the spilled diesel, which percolated right through into the substrate. So that was a clear violation of SPCC, and so we've got some cases going against them.
We'll take one more question, and we better get going. Go ahead. Okay.
Once I missed a memo, I thought as CUPA inspectors we had some limitations on what we could question as far as the PE engineer plan, as far as calculations. Has that changed at all? Because his question is if there's a clear violation that we see on an SPCC facility with regarding a plan stamped by an engineer, what do we do as CUPA inspectors? And typically on that, it was my understanding we didn't have the authority to question the stamp.
Right. So the
calculation.
Right.
And then we were to EPA.
Right. So what you're saying, I'll just repeat it because I think it's an important point, is that we are taught in our inspector training that we don't have the authority to question a professional engineer, that if it came to that point that we would need to refer that to US EPA, and the regional administrator has that authority to do so. But I think what Pete was talking about is that as a CUPA inspector, if you see something that looks odd, you can ask for more information. Maybe, a page got left out, or, something. There could be some reason or explanation for that information saying that it's not subject to sized containment, or the containment is way less than you think it should be. There could be reasons why. It could be an impracticability determination that's built into the plan that's maybe not clearly defined or referenced in the plan. So questions are good, and that's okay to ask for more information. But I think the training that we received is still the case that we're not the regional administrator, and it clearly states in the Code of Federal Regulations that the regional administrator would need to take up discussion with a PE certification. But I think it would get through a lot of steps before it would get to that point. No, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Yes. Very good. Okay. All right. So in this great guidance for regional inspectors, and if you're with industry and business in the audience or consultants, this would be a great document for you to review as well. If you're trying to if you're, say, a qualified facility and you need some help in doing the calculations yourself for figuring out what that capacity should be, it's pretty simple. Going back to geometry that we learned in grade school, just multiplying the length, width times the height, making sure you account for displacement of the tanks if there's other tanks in the containment, and then going from there. And this just gives an example in the SPCC regional guidance for inspectors in Chapter 4. The other thing that we need to make sure is that the freeboard is addressed if it's outside storage and subject to precipitation. And EPA, again, does not describe any particular method you can use. Of course, they just provide guidance. They have data from the 25-year, 24-hour storm event. And then also there's the 110% rule of thumb that can be used for that figure. A question here?
No, you answered my question.
Oh, good. And then I already talked about tank displacement, so making sure that that's taken into consideration. So I think as CUPA inspectors, most likely if it's an engineered plan and a PE certified plan, that the PE has done lots of plans, and they probably do this in their sleep, and you wouldn't really question it. You don't see anything that looks off at the facility. For our qualified facilities, they may need a little bit of help. I know I've gotten those questions. I get a lot of phone calls where people say, well, how do I figure out the capacity of my containment? How do I know it's the right amount? So you may get those questions, and you could refer them to this guidance document for assistance. And the questions actually spurred on, we kind of got ahead of ourselves a little bit ago in talking about what does sufficiently impervious mean. And so Pete already talked a little bit about it, but I'll just follow up with stating that in the 2002 preamble, it talked about that how secondary containment is designed, implemented, and must be maintained to meet the standard of sufficiently impervious. And that's something that has to be taken into account, and it must be capable of containing oil until cleanup occurs. And Pete already talked about that. Now, I have had questions also, do I have to put in a double wall tank now? You tell them you got to get an SPCC plan as a CUPA inspector, and then I have the facility say, well, what is that? And I explain to them what it is, and then I get asked, well, do I have to have a double wall tank? Do I have to change out my tank? Well, how do I do this? What do I do now? I never had been asked to have a double wall tank before, or never had to put in containment for this tank. Lots of inspectors have come through here. Now I have to pour concrete? What do you mean I have to pour concrete? And they're concerned. The facilities are concerned about a lot of costs that they may incur. But again, please, as CUPA inspectors and for the business in the audience, just remember that it doesn't say you have to have a double wall tank in the SPCC rule. It doesn't say you have to have concrete. There could be it could be a packed earthen berm. that maybe you have an oil tank and that earthen berm is sufficiently impervious to contain a release, that may be sufficient. It just depends, and there's a lot of flexibility built into the rule. Of course, earthen berms would definitely set off a red flag, and especially if it's something like gasoline or something like that. So, it's something just to keep in mind.
I think the comment. So with the federal rule, we're looking at protection of, in fact, navigable waters. There's surface waters driven solely by that. And so the sufficiently imperviousness aspect gets a little muddy, if you will, in terms of, well, there's no surface water in the immediate area, and there's a tank overfill, and some of that fuel, let's say, has percolated into the soil. And maybe even impacted groundwater. That's not necessarily a federal SPCC violation, but it would be a violation of the APSA rule because you are driving protection of groundwater. So I think sufficiently impervious is a key component of the APSA rule for you guys to understand in terms of when you look at it, what are you looking at, what's the material stored, what's the basin material comprised of. Those are some of the questions that you folks want to be sort of looking at closely. Depth to groundwater. Is there, for us at the federal level, is there a nexus from sub-groundwater under the facility and a nearby river, stream, lake, or bay, or ocean? Is there a nexus to that groundwater? That would be something I'd be looking at. But just considerations for APSA.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. All right, so we've talked about general containment and specific containment. We're getting to the end of our objective number 2 here. You do? Okay, so in review, we're talking about general and the differences between general and specific containment, the 2 types of containment. And one of the things that it talks about in the guidance for inspectors is that when we talk about general containment, that active measures are something that can be used, but EPA in general discourages active measures from being used for sized containment. And although it doesn't specifically state that in the SPCC rule, it states that in the regional guidance that sized containment is supposed to be designed for a catastrophic release, and general containment is for the most likely discharge. So maybe it's okay to have absorbent materials ready to go for the most likely discharge, but if we're talking about a catastrophic failure of a tank, then passive containment or something that's going to be there no matter what is the superior type of containment, and that's what EPA states in the rule. But there is flexibility. So just remembering that as CUPA inspectors, that it's all performance-based. Okay, so going back to our little keeping you awake thing here and doing a little bit of review. Now, we had a little bit of confusion on oilfield equipment. So for this question, when I talked about oilfield equipment, I'm talking about oilfield equipment that's subject to general containment. I don't want you to think I'm giving you a trick question. And so, okay, so here's your question. Specific size containment applies to oilfield equipment, piping, loading and unloading areas, and oil handling areas. I sort of already gave you the answer, didn't I? I just didn't want someone to say we confused them earlier. Okay, let's go. All right, okay, I've got candy here. Okay, all right. So, let's see. Here's another one. Sized containment must contain 100% of the largest tank plus sufficient freeboard to contain the rain from a 25-year, 24-hour storm event. This one's kind of tricky. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, go. Okay. We do? Okay. Okay.
Okay, so I wanted to jump in and make a comment about this one. And I think in reviewing this and working with Sandy, I believe that I overlooked this particular slide in terms of making a clarification. The 110% or the 25-year, 24-hour storm event, those are not language in the SPCC regulation. Neither shows up in the rule. The 25-year, 24-hour storm event is what is listed in our SPCC preamble as the appropriate calculation to determine adequate freeboard for precipitation. Certainly, the ultimate decision is going to rest with the professional engineer. EPA does, in the preamble, suggest a 25-year, 24-hour storm event. American Petroleum Institute, years back, kind of came up with a 110% rule that would be adequate for freeboard. EPA doesn't use the 110%. We refer to the 25-year, 24-hour storm event. If the professional engineer determines that 110% is adequate, or that's a volume greater than what would be the 25-year, 24-hour storm event, then that's fine if they certify that into the plan. If it's slightly less than the 25-year, 24-hour storm event, then maybe there could be some sort of contingency planning or procedural controls built in the SPCC and the operations of the secondary containment, drainage inspection, et cetera, that may work that out. But I just want to be clear that So technically it should be false. Technically is
That's
false.
That's right. So those of you who said false, you were right. So it doesn't have to use the 25-year, 24-hour storm event. What's that?
If you have a roof or a canopy over that area, you would not have to.
Oh, if you have a canopy over it, you don't even have to worry about it. Right. Very good. Okay. All right, here's another one. Would active containment measures be appropriate for satisfying the specific containment requirements of a major tank failure? Good. All right. Good job. No. Major tank failure, you really need sized containment, and active measures are not really good for specific containment. All right, so we're on to, so we've covered, hopefully everybody understands the concepts of general and specific containment. We have, gone over it a few times. If you're still a little unclear, you can definitely come up after class. But hopefully we've covered those topics, and you'll leave here having a better idea of the difference and when they apply. So let's just talk a little bit about impracticability determination, possible exceptions and alternatives. And I have this statue, the Rodin statue, thinking, because it always makes me think when as soon as I have stuff figured out, then there's some kind of an exception to it. So that always messes me up. And the other thing to remember with SPCC, we keep saying it over and over again, but you really have to put that in your head, because it's not like our other unified programs where we have a lot of mandates. It relies on the expertise of the SPCC preparer. Who's the SPCC preparer? It depends. So give me some examples. Engineer, the operator, the manager, someone at the facility. Is it the inspector? No. Is it they may hire a consultant to do it. but hopefully they understand the facility and meet with the facility. So you may have a facility, and I had this happen recently. I told you guys I had a big chain of oil change facilities that asked me for help developing their SPCC plans for all of their 23 facilities in our county. And they wanted to make one plan and then just change the address on the template and use it for all their facilities, which is okay because all their facilities are very similar. They're the type that have like a basement area with the tanks underneath. So I was like, sure, I'll help you out. But they didn't have any expertise at all on it. They didn't even know what SPCC stood for when we started it. So it was difficult in telling them, and they're asking me, so what should we put in our plan for what our containment is? What is our secondary containment? I said, well, you got to figure it out. And they were like, well, how? And so it was a real struggle. So this can be a bit of a challenge. If the containers are moving around, we talked about if it's under the control of the operator, there's some exceptions that may apply. We talked about if it's inside, and Pete talked about this a little bit with your elevator question, that you kind of think in your mind, oh, well, it's just the containment that's around the tank, but if it's going to flow into just another room, but it's still inside the building, it's not going to go into the storm drain or off-site, then maybe not just that room, but another room that's nearby could count as that secondary containment or sized containment. So if all that doesn't work, then the facility does have the option of doing something called an impracticability determination. Pete has a whole nother class on that topic, so we're not going to talk about it in here. Just a real fast overview is that the facility has the ability to determine that sized containment isn't required, and they can do other alternatives instead of having sized containment. What's that?
Isn't practicable.
If it's not practicable, then they can have alternatives that would comply. So I'm just going to jump you into this question here and see if you know the answer. If you remember your APSA inspector training, this was right off the exam for the APSA inspector training. So what is an impracticability determination? I'll let you guys read the choices here before I click the clicker. So is it when the inspector determines it's impracticable to have secondary containment? Number 2, when the facility determines an SPCC plan is not practical. Number 3, when the facility finds that containment methods are impracticable and they substitute a combination of other measures. Or 4, what a facility can do when the only reason they can't install secondary containment is because it's too expensive. Okay, so there you go. Let's see who needs to go to Pete's class. All right. Good job. Okay. Very good. So when the facility finds that containment methods are not practicable and they come up with alternative methods. So let's come here. So really, and like I said, Pete's going to have his class, but what they have to do is conduct periodic integrity testing on containers and tanks, prepare a Part 109 contingency plan unless they have a facility response plan, and then provide a written commitment of manpower, equipment, and materials. So that's what impracticability determination is. And I was a little unclear on this when Pete and I were putting together this presentation on if a qualified facility that is preparing their plan can do an impracticability determination. And what he explained to me earlier this week is that if it's a qualified facility and they're doing their own plan, they could still be self-certify the plan, but just for the impracticability determination, they would need to have a PE certify that impracticability and alternative means and put together that portion and certify that part of the plan. All right, so our last objective here is understanding the inspector's role. Now, you're going to be able to find a lot of this information in the downloaded information. And so really our role as inspectors is to review the plan, see what they've written, see what they've talked about as far as inspections and all of those other things we talk about in the APSA world. But specifically for secondary containment, we're looking to see if it's adequate, if it appears adequate and the right size. We're looking at general containment, the example that I mentioned to you guys earlier, if they say they're going to have active measures and they have they don't have a spill kit in that area, then that would be a red flag. Does it include freeboard? If it is in an outside area, is that addressed? Are the calculations documented? Do they have operating procedures? Is there erosion of the system? Look at the permeability, if it looks like it's sufficiently impervious. Do you see some plants that are growing and a bunch of weeds and debris in the containment that could... do you see staining outside the containment? You're looking at all of those things. If you see a big hole or a big crack, that could be a red flag. And then looking at their records and looking at the details in the plan and making sure that the plan is being fully implemented. So, for example, when there's some type of rainwater that builds up inside of the containment, then they would need to empty out that rainwater and keep logs to show that there was no sheen on that rotor that was inside the containment area. If you saw on that log that somebody wrote there was a sheen, then that would be something to kind of make you ask more questions. Well, how come you had a sheen on that rainwater? Did you have some kind of a spill or leak? And you could ask those kinds of questions. And then last of all, making sure that they've implemented good engineering practices. And that's very subjective. There's not really a definition. If you read this guidance document, it'll give you a little bit more information. What I think about good engineering practices, I think about something that makes sense. A lot of us are college educated. Maybe you're very technical. You've gone to some type of trade school, and you kind of have an idea of what makes sense to contain and keep things from spilling into the storm drain or going off-site. Does that make sense? Is it a good engineering practice in place, or is it something that looks like it's sort of taped together, or that term Mickey Mouse, or something that it just doesn't look right, like Pete was mentioning earlier. The other thing to think about is that it has to address the piping and ancillary equipment, and making sure that there's some type of a prevention program in place in the SPCC plan and protection program in place. And then, of course, if there was some type of a spill, that they have addressed that and properly cleaned it up and didn't just leave the spill in the containment area, that it's cleaned up and not just left in that containment area. All right, so I have another question for you here, and then we're almost done. All right. So the inspector's role includes using your experience to determine the proper method of secondary containment for the facility. Good. Okay, for those of you who thought it was a yes, please remember it's up to the facility to decide what the proper containment should be. That's not our job as inspectors. We would just review that as inspectors and, of course, provide some guidance. Okay, and then we got another one here. Qualified facilities, and here's the good question I had earlier. So if they want to do an impracticability determination, but they're a qualified facility doing their own plan, can they certify their plan without the use of a professional engineer? Cannot use an impracticability determination in lieu of required containment. All right. You ready? Okay. Oh, maybe I confused you. Is it the wording? Okay.
You can still do a tier 2 plan. Impracticability statement is signed and stamped by an engineer, correct? The impracticability.
Well, tier 1 and tier 2 are both qualified facilities.
But the
So,
engineer's not stamping the tier 2 plan.
right.
Supplemental, stamping supplemental impracticability.
Okay. Okay, so I'll just make sure I cover the point. It's a good thing I did this question. Maybe it's a flaw in the question, so I'll definitely look at that. But just to make sure everybody's got it, if it's a qualified facility, they have less than 10,000 gallons, they're preparing their own plan. If they want to do an impracticability determination and say, I don't need containment, then they've got to have a PE help them out.
Is that correct?
This slide question is true. They cannot certify their own plan and make a claim of impracticability. They have to have a professional engineer certify the impracticability claim and the equivalent environmental measure that would be substituting for the impracticability.
They can do a tier 2 plan and have that separate, right?
As a PE subs.
Either any qualified facility, whether tier 1 or 2, would require a professional engineer to certify any claim of impracticability and environmental equivalent measure.
Okay.
So the slide as it sits is generally true.
Okay. All right, one more. Now get out your notes. What section in CFR Title 40 has the requirement for general containment? Oh, this one didn't have my question thingy on it. Oh, well. Okay, so here's the answer. I already gave it to you. 112.7C is for general containment. And what section has the requirement for specific containment? 112.8 little c2 is for specific containment.
That's a tricky one. It should be 7H for loading unloading racks, and 112.8 or 112.12 C2 for petroleum bulk storage or vegetable bulk storage oils.
Oh, there's other sections that apply. Okay.
That's vegetable not relevant in APSA world.
Vegetable oil not relevant in APSA world, right. And here's the link to the SPCC regional guidance. Any more questions? Yes, right here.
You said transformer oil is exempt under APSA. Does that carry over also to the federal SPCC?
The question is, transformer or oil field electrical equipment is exempt, has exemptions under APSA. Does that apply for federal? And the answer is no. Oil in any type of equipment is subject to the federal rule. Good question. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your feedback.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Sure.